Good afternoon. Thanks for coming along to this session on day 4. Seems like a never-ending conference. Very tired. But let's get started with yet another session on user profile synchronization or user profile service provisioning with SharePoint Server 2016. For my benefit, if you could get a show of hands, how many of you are already running SharePoint 2016 today? Okay, good. And how many of you are using the Active Directory import as part of that? Most of you. Okay, thank you. So a little bit about me. I'm an architect based in Edinburgh in the United Kingdom. Got my contact details there on the slide if you want to follow up with questions that aren't covered either in the session or later in the expo hall, etc. Meaningless certifications there on the right-hand side, but as you probably know, I focus very much on large deployments and helping the larger enterprise customers with those deployment challenges, also working heavily these days with Azure and data center stack. So the agenda for the talk is really, first of all, to cover easily the most important aspects of doing any type of profile synchronization work, or indeed leveraging the user profile service application more generally, and that is identity management principles. For all the problems of the past engine in terms of its configuration and setup and the security requirements and so on, the root cause of virtually all failed user profile related issues are in the non-technical side of things. So we'll spend quite a bit of time emphasizing these aspects, because these will then naturally guide what we look at with the other tools available to help us with profile synchronization. So we'll talk briefly about the options that are available to us in SharePoint 2016. Obviously, the main headline there is the removal of the user profile synchronization service from previous versions. We'll look briefly at Active Directory import in terms of its feature capability, and then spend probably the second half of the talk focusing in on leveraging the Microsoft Identity Manager product to achieve the same types of scenarios that we used to have to use user profile synchronization for. And yes, the naming is very confusing, so I'll probably call it FIM at least 10 times in this session. Okay. And I'll walk through the key configuration, the toolkit that's been provided by Microsoft at this point to help people get started, and then walk through a little bit more advanced scenarios and concepts of the product. So hopefully that's the session you're expecting. So in terms of user profiles, they really are fundamental to a successful or a successfully adopted SharePoint environment, especially on premises. And the reality is, and it's slightly unfortunate, but if you're in the business of running SharePoint environments, you're also in the identity management business, because all of the feature investments over the last 2 major releases from a functional perspective in some way, shape, or form rely on the user profile existing. You can't initiate a workflow if there's no user profile available for that user, as one example. So over time, this importance is always increasing, especially as new workloads come into the product or new styles of working are in the product that leverage that sort of social identity information as well. So yeah, every version comes along, it's increasing a dependency in pretty much every investment area of the product. Now, the real problem with this stuff is that identity management is not a technical endeavor. It's predominantly a political one, right? So there's tools available from Microsoft and other enterprise vendors that can help once you've dealt with all of the political problems, but that's a very small part of the overall activity. Identity management is 10% technology, 90% everything else. And that's a problem because as the SharePoint project within a company, it's unlikely we are going to have the power, the ability to deal with the everything else because we're part of a SharePoint project or a desktop refresh project or something like that. So it's very much a common challenge we see everywhere with every deployment. So some examples of what everything else is data ownership. So in most organizations, the employee ID is owned by HR. and much of that similar data would be owned and managed by HR. They've probably got some legacy line of business system for managing that data as well. So it's not owned by IT. There can oftentimes be very significant sort of data protection across departments in the same organization. And there's also a culture aspect here. Some organizations have got a very modern culture, if you will, and they're not too concerned about things like the privacy of data. Other organizations are much more conservative, and they're very strict on that. And if anybody here lives and works in Germany, you'll be aware of the privacy regulations that mandate certain data about users is not available to the other employees of the company, such as the year of birth. So lots of things like that have a significant impact on our planning activity. Then there's the data quality. Is there anybody from Microsoft in the room? You'll be familiar with this, the global address list comedy. But basically, the data has to be there to be useful. It has to be up to date. It has to be clean. It's like mobile telephone numbers. Are they up to date? The office location where you work, those kind of things are the canonical examples. Then you've got the system quality, so the health of the systems that store identity information. Health of Active Directory, there's been a massive step change in terms of guidance of how large Active Directory should be deployed, but we still suffer the consequences of the age-old guidance of lots of organically grown Active Directories that perhaps originally were NT4 resource domains. But then there's also, think about the line of business system, which is usually much older than an NT4 domain and is still running on some physical server somewhere, doesn't have high availability, goes offline for massive periods when it's having updates, those kind of things. And then the access control to the identity data. So what type of system permissions are necessary for the consuming applications in order to go and access that identity, especially again in legacy line of business systems. We can very often be required to use legacy authentication mechanisms and deal with the problems related to getting that set up correctly. So these four things, every time we do a health check, we always hit every one of these areas. It hasn't changed. I've been doing identity management since 1998 when I deployed a product called Zoom It Via, which became Microsoft Identity Manager. Every project I've worked on has had these four issues to some degree or another. How many of you also run Active Directory as well as SharePoint? A few of you? Yeah, you're the underpaid, overworked guys, right? So this one's easy for you because you can just say to yourself, hey man, give me that account that I need. But for everybody else, you know what the default answer from a directory service administrator is, right? No. Doesn't matter what the question is, the answer's going to be no. So this is hugely important. This is especially common in Europe now, where Active Directory is becoming more and more often is outsourced to another third party to manage, especially the large ones. And so, getting the change control for an account with the right permissions, etc., is still hugely important. This issue doesn't go away in SharePoint 2016. We still need the appropriate permissions on the directory systems we're going to speak to. But also consider things, when do they do Windows updates on the domain controllers? You don't want that to interfere with our sync operations. These are all simple things, but they happen so frequently. That's why they're being highlighted. We still have the same prerequisites in terms of the account requirements necessary, regardless of which tool we use to perform Active Directory sync. And I'll show a little bit more about that as well in the demonstration. Now, some people get annoyed when I show this slide. That's part of the fun. This is so important. We've got to think through what we need first. We can't do it without requirements. You can't wing this. Many people do, but the inevitable always happens. You have to throw it away, go back, and do what should have been done in the first place, and plan it out. So do some planning, plan some more, have a cup of coffee, do a little more planning. Because without this, your identity sync will be a nightmare for you to manage, The longer you leave it in that state, you know, over time, the impact of that will continue to wreak havoc and make it very difficult for you to leverage, you know, new workloads in the product that rely on user profiles. Okay. So that's the sort of identity management primer stuff. We could spend, you know, many more hours on the theory, but, you know, this is a technical conference. So now we'll get back into the SharePoint stuff. So as you've probably already heard, we basically lost the UPS, or the embedded FIM, that we had in SharePoint 2010 and SharePoint 2013. And so we effectively now have two options, well, three really. The first one, AD import. Then we have an option that's in the product called External Identity Manager, which is basically just saying SharePoint doesn't care, it's going to be dealt with by some other system. The best system of choice here is the Microsoft Identity Manager product, but we could use Oracle's Identity Manager product if we wanted to. Okay? And if we had the skills in that product and there was a way that it could hook up to SharePoint and all the rest of it. And we can also use custom code. And that actually now, whilst we encourage in virtually all scenarios not to write full trust solutions for SharePoint farms, this is an area where it's a viable option for some requirements. And I'll talk a little bit about that when we get to the demo as well. So when it was announced at this event last year that user profile sync was going, there was a spontaneous round of applause in the room. You know, it's the joke that there was nothing wrong with it, right? It's massively efficient, never had any problems, dead easy, right? Easy to work with. It was interesting because at that event, after the round of applause, you know, it's like, great, but what replaces it effectively? And that's the key consideration, or the key takeaway from this session, is to understand what user profile sync gave us aside from getting stuck on starting, because it provided a lot for us. And so we need to think, especially if we're thinking about potentially moving or upgrading to SharePoint 2016, you know, we've got to do that think plan slide to understand how much of that we actually made use of on a daily basis and how to replicate the functionality within the new world. Okay, so Active Directory import, very straightforward. It imports only, so one-way import from one system, and that system is Active Directory. It's super fast, super reliable, super efficient. It's very straightforward. But it's also quite limited in terms of the capability from a sort of wider identity management perspective. Active Directory import effectively is in place assuming that there is one source record of identity system in the organization and everything is in there, and that is Active Directory. Or indeed, that you've used some other identity management tooling to get that data into AD in order for SharePoint to sync with it. So for most of you, you're probably thinking, well, that doesn't sound like my organization. If you work for an organization of more than 10,000 people, the chances that all the identity information is AD is basically nil. Right? The data is elsewhere. We support multiple domains, but that means we then have a connection per domain. So again, if you're in a large organization, you can end up with 40, 50 connections. That gets very difficult to manage over time. We can do all the standard things, shadow accounts, custom property mappings, as long as we don't touch the internal SharePoint properties, so one's labeled SPS-. We've got the same authentication mechanisms that we have had available in user profile sync. So if we need to do the sync with ADFS, for example, that all works, and it's identical to how it was way back 2 releases now in SharePoint 2010. But we still need our replicating directory changes and the NetBIOS domain name configuration when we're working with this. The DIR sync, as hopefully everybody now is aware, is just merely the right the permission to be able to use a change log. So instead of replicating everything all the time or synchronizing everything all the time, we're only doing the delta or the changes. And if the NetBIOS domain name is different than the fully qualified domain name, so the legacy domain name is different, you'll still need to set this configuration as well. So these are quite important. They still come up very often in support cases that these things are missing, or they were there and then they've been removed by perhaps a slightly aggressive Active Directory administrator. Simple stuff, of course, but extremely important. Now, provisioning user profile application will retain the database, the sync database. It'll be an empty database, okay? So we no longer need it, but don't delete that database. It's just an empty database. You don't need to worry about the high availability for an empty database, but please don't delete it because the user profile service application still thinks it needs to be there. This is slightly incorrect. We don't retain the default mode anymore because the default mode is now Active Directory import. But this is the toggle from the previous version to switch between the modes, and we just lose one of the options on this screen. Obviously, you don't need to start the UPS service instance. There's not going to be any stuck on starting because the service instance does not exist anymore on the box. We don't install it. The bits aren't there. I've mentioned the database already. We can also script connections, and this has been true now for 2 versions. So for 2013 and 2016, we can use the star.sp profile sync connection commandlets for scripting connections. And this is how you would script connections with Active Directory import to do multi-tenancy. If you're in that world, this is the mechanism by which you create a sync connection for each organizational unit. Then you can go ahead and run the previous commandlet, the site subscription profile configuration. Watch out with the remove though, because it'll only take out the OU from the connection, not the actual delete. It won't delete the connection. So a little bit of sample script there that shows you how to work around that. So some of the limitations. We can't do contact resolution across the forest boundary. That's pretty important when you're working with the manager field in Active Directory. As I mentioned earlier, you can't map the SharePoint system properties. You can't do things like augmenting with data from an external line of business system because there's no BDC support here. Some other things that are less relevant, but they still come up. Mapping different data types is not supported, and mapping 2 different attributes to the same SharePoint property is not supported. Now that last one, you might be thinking, why would anybody do that? But it happens all over the place. It's a very sort of old school way of achieving more with less, as it were, in terms of again, it's data quality in Active Directory. And so oftentimes, the wrong attribute is being used for a very important piece of data. And so these are the types of things you have to kind of do to get that in SharePoint nicely. But we can't do these kind of little fix-ups or tweaks with AD import. We have query filters using LDAP queries. A fantastic UI for editing them down the bottom there. It's got plenty of room to type that guy out. But watch out, they're inclusion-based as opposed to exclusion-based, which would be how an identity management system does it. I always recommend you validate the filter with ADSI edit before you plug it into the screen in central administration. And lastly on these things, just because there's a LDAP query on some blog site somewhere out on the internet doesn't necessarily mean it's not going to tank the query, right? Because these queries can take quite a long time. And if you do test them with ADSI edit, you can actually see the progress of the query returning the objects. And that's even in a small environment, like a demo setup, for example. So yeah, be very cautious with these things, because most of the samples are doing things that are extremely inefficient. So we're using Active Directory import, which is the most efficient way to do this, and then we basically hoodwink it by putting a nasty query on top of it, which ruins the speed and performance benefits that we wanted. Full import is required, just as it was with user profile sync, when a configuration change occurs. So a configuration change would be adding or removing a connection, adding or removing an organizational unit, changing that filter, changing property mappings. So we always want to make sure that we perform a full import immediately after, if possible, we've applied these configuration changes. And we should also do a purge of non-imported objects. And this is incredibly important, especially if we're changing modes or we have significantly changed our configuration, because we could very easily still have objects in the profile database that should not have been part of that latest import. And so these commandlets will report which ones will be purged, and then we go ahead and purge them. Okay. The other thing, just before I switch to the MIM stuff on Active Directory import, is to understand that it is the most heavily used sync engine for SharePoint on the planet. It's used by Office 365 to import all that profile data from the intermediary directory that is synced with to SharePoint's profile store. So you can be confident of using AD import if it meets your requirements. However, you might want to do more than import accounts. You might want to export some data back to the line of business system. You might want to include data from a variety of systems, different directories, databases, web services. And that's where a real identity management product comes into play. So we used to have a cut-down version of FIM, as it was called at the time, in the product. But why remove it? Well, the real reason is that it just doesn't make sense to continue to maintain these different branches of legacy code. There's no way any organization can sustainably do that over, decades. And so the original UPS is code from 2000, it says 2010 there, it's really 2009. And it was quite a limited product as well in comparison to what we have now. So, the decision is, well, either we kind of rip that out and do it again with the new stuff and then end up basically in the same situation, in the same problem, 3 or 4 years down the line. That doesn't make any sense. Obviously, there's a converged code base now with SharePoint 2016 and Office, SharePoint Online effectively converging the code together. So, it's not necessary in Office 365. So another reason to get rid of it. And fundamentally, the approach that was used to speak to SharePoint made use of a thing called an ECMA v1 management agent, which is extremely inefficient and very painful. That was the major reason why sync would take so long for large amounts of profile data. So it's definitely the right decision, because we now have the ability to leverage the best-in-class identity management product in the marketplace. One piece of that product, the MIM synchronization service, basically the new name for what's always, it's been the FIM sync engine, it was an ILM sync engine, this has been the thing that's been around since Zoom It Via. This is available at no additional license cost to SharePoint 2016 server customers, okay? But that only applies to the sync engine. If you want to leverage the identity management portal, the btrieve stuff, the password reset stuff, the certificate management, all of those other pieces need to be licensed separately, okay? But the sync engine piece, the core piece that we're interested in here, there's no additional cost. Then we have a thing called the SharePoint connector. That's basically a downloadable management agent. You install it on top of the sync engine, and this is the thing that's responsible for speaking to the user profile web services in order to perform import and export operations. This has been revved, this has been available since 2014, something like that, a few years now, but it's been revved And the new version has got a number of improvements over the one that's currently being used with the FIM deployments. To use this version of the SharePoint connector, we must be on Identity Manager 2016. We can't be on FIM, SP1. That's a no-go. It must be this version of Identity Manager. So with this, once this is in place, we basically separate all of the complexity for business continuity of the user profile service, and we can manage that just like we manage all the other service application databases, because we don't have that sync database, or rather we just have an empty one. So we can log ship an empty database if you really want to. It's kind of pointless. But that all then moves away from the SharePoint side of things. There is a kind of counterpoint to that, though, because you still need to deal with business continuity management for the MIM deployment, okay, which is a very different world. Basically, it's a world of SQL Server clusters for the sync service piece. It allows us to build end-to-end identity solutions. You may be aware that this core technology, the MIM sync engine, is also the core underlying technology for all of the tools that are used to synchronize on-premises user data to Office 365. So again, an example of how it's being used for a different scenario, but on a massive scale, and it delivers, right? It delivers the capability. If you already have identity manager skills in your organization, or you have consultants, these can be leveraged to build a better solution than we would have if it was all just contained within SharePoint. And of course, it allows us to address the most common aspects of the technical side of identity management, i.e., in many organizations, Active Directory is not the definitive source of identity. It's often a line of business database. So in the world of Active Directory import and user profile sync, we make a broad assumption that when somebody joins a company, the first HR process is to create an account in Active Directory. Well, that's very seldom the case. So we need MIM to be able to deal with those type of scenarios, or a product like it. Now, there's a big downside to all of this from a SharePoint perspective, of course, because it means that we now need to become MIM experts as well as SharePoint experts, and we're probably not going to get a raise for doing that, right? It's just going to be expected of us. And MIM is quite a complex product, and it's unfamiliar to most SharePoint practitioners. So it's not the intent today to do a boot camp on MIM, but you must, if you go down this road, you need to be comfortable with these 3 key characteristics. So the first is that MIM is a state-based metadirectory. There's other types of metadirectories that use agents. So you install an agent on your domain controllers, you install an agent on your SAP environment, and then the agent, a bit like an operations manager type approach, where they suck the data to the metadirectory. MIM uses a different approach of having state, in other words, a metaverse. And this basically allows the system to be no-touch effectively to all of the connected systems. And we have a principle of confirming receipts, which is, again, one reason why things seem to take longer than they need to, because actually, in effect, we do everything twice to make sure that it worked. And that's a principle of identity management from the late 1970s. Then we have a connector space for each connected system that we're working with, whether it be Active Directory, Oracle, LDAP other LDAP systems, etc. So that connector space represents the data from each of those systems, and there's one for each system. And then we have the metaverse, which is the consolidated identity information across all the connected systems. And as we walk through performing synchronization activities, we're manipulating the data across these 2 spaces effectively. And then, of course, at some stage, we'll do an export to a consuming system like SharePoint. We will be providing a lot more resources, documentation and walkthroughs on a lot of these concepts over the next 2 or 3 months. So look out for that. But for the time being, this is about as far as we can get into it within the time we have available to us. What has been provided to date by Microsoft is a thing called the MimSync Toolkit. This is on GitHub, and it's basically designed to replicate effectively what user profile sync did by default. Okay, so work with Active Directory, uses the profile property mappings that user profile sync used to have, and do it without requiring really much effort on the part of the administrator. It basically is codified as a PowerShell module. So you run this PowerShell module on the MIM server, and it will then create the management agents and the provisioning code necessary to do an Active Directory synchronization run. We also configure things called run profiles, which with an additional step you can use the task scheduler to make sure that profile sync is running overnight or on a scheduled basis. And I'll show you that in a little while. In fact, I'm going to show you it right now. A seamless transition. Okay, so this environment here is reasonably straightforward. I have 2 SharePoint farms, Active Directory, SQL Server, of course, and Microsoft Identity Manager. And on screen at the moment, we can see SharePoint 2013 profile service application. We've got about 200 users in here, or 200 profiles in here. Very straightforward. I'm just going to walk through some of the information. So it's the standard stuff that you would expect to see for a user. Oh, hang on, let me get rid of this org chart. We'll come over here. We search for Microsoft Certified Architects, and we've got this veritable crew here. And as you would expect, various bits of profile data for each of these users. We need to actually click the link before you go to the page. So you can see, it's got the image here, its email address, phone number, but we've also got some additional information in here like schools, employee ID, employee type. Basic, simple type attributes that are very common in most deployments. So we've done that, of course, using user profile sync. So we have a sync connection, and you can see you can see that we've got one for AD. Then we're using BDC to augment that profile data from AD with some extra things from a line of business database. Okay. So the intent is to replicate this functionality using SharePoint 2016 and the Microsoft Identity Manager. The domain controller, you can see here's the organizational unit that I'm going to sync with. Within that, I've got some country OUs. We do have a few disabled accounts, just half a dozen or so there. And the accounts all have thumbnail photo data. So we're not using a URL for the image. It's actually binary data, as you can see here. So we want to replicate that, or we want to get all of that stuff present and correct over into SharePoint 2016. These are the database that I've also got some other information. So this table basically shows, some school information, and this is what we call a MIM-friendly database schema. You'll notice that we have a column there in this view. It's not part of the table, it's just in the view where everything's a school, right? It's called attribute name. And so this is an example of what we've always had to do, really, if we want to work with multi-value data with BCS and user profiles, is to have a MIM-friendly schema. And we can do that easily just by creating a view, right? We don't need to change the source database. We just need to add another view to it. And then this is the employee ID, whether it's a contractor or a regular employee, what their department is. So the department isn't in Active Directory in this example. And then what their status is, whether the employee is on leave, et cetera, and so on. So it's just a kind of bit of a hokey, contrived database, but it does the job in terms of the concepts we need to cover. So the first thing we need to do is ensure that on our SharePoint 2016 environment, okay, so we switch now to the SharePoint 2016 farm, and I need to make this a little bit bigger so I can see it. That was really silly. So I've got one profile at the moment. That's my account, the administrator here that I'm logged in as. That's not a farm account or anything. It's just a regular user. Now, we go into here, configure sync settings, and we have this option to choose whether we want to use AD import or whether we want to use an external identity management tool. And when it eventually loads, there we go. Now, the first thing you've got to do at this stage is make sure you do not click the Enable External Identity Manager. Okay? There's currently an issue that if we do that, we won't retrieve the correct reference data for reference objects. So just avoid it. Now, the thing to be aware of is because of that, the system, SharePoint, still thinks we're using AD import, and by default, AD import schedules a sync run every 5 minutes. Okay? Now, at the moment, that's okay. It's not going to do anything because I haven't created a sync connection. So the second thing you need to do is make sure you don't create a sync connection, because then that's going to run every 5 minutes and make a total mess of everything, and you'll have to throw it away and start again. It gets better from here. Okay, so I'm on the Microsoft Identity Manager server here. By the way, don't co-locate this on SharePoint machine. Keep it separate from SharePoint. But all I've done is install the Sync Service Manager. There's nothing configured in here. It's all empty. Okay? I've also installed the SharePoint connector. And this is one of the key interesting aspects. If I just go ahead and click Create here, just to show you the list of all the systems that we support out of the box with this version of the product. You know, so that gives you an indication. That's a lot better than the 4 that we had with User Profile Sync. Okay? And obviously, you can buy connectors for a multitude of other systems from third parties. There's literally thousands on the marketplace for speaking to other systems. So the toolkit, as I mentioned, is a PowerShell module, SharePoint Sync. So I'm going to go ahead and run this little bit of script here, and then I'll talk through the important aspects of it. This is always a worrying thing to type in on stage. Okay, so I've set some variables here. I've got the working path, which is effectively where the PowerShell module lives. Right? So this is not a PowerShell gallery module. We hope to move it there in the future, but right now you've got to sort of specify your working directory. Then we've got the DNS name of the forest that we want to work with. In our case, that's fabricam.com. Then we've got 2 accounts. The first one is the account that's going to work with Active Directory, so the account that we'll use within the Active Directory Management Agent. And in this case, I've called that SPP Sync. Okay? That's the account that needs replicating directory changes. Then we have Central Admin. This is how we connect in the management agents. We connect to the user profile import-export web service hosted within Central Admin. No, you cannot use another web application. It must be central administration. Therefore, very important that you use secure sockets layer for Central Admin, because this is the point of connectivity, with all that user profile data flowing across the link. Then the next account here is called the farm admin account. If you don't care about thumbnail photo data, in other words, you don't have thumbnail photo data in AD and you don't want to import it this way, you can use any farm administrator account. If you want the thumbnail photo to work, you must use the farm account. Okay. Then I have some OUs, which is basically the only one important for this demonstration is this one here. So I'm just kind of overwriting the previous version. That's that OU that I showed you. Then we basically plug those variables into this commandlet, which is going to do all of the work for us. So this is basically installing the management agents, configuring run profiles, It deploys a .NET assembly into the Identity Manager. And it also gives us a couple of warnings down here. And it's basically telling us, before we can do anything, we need to go and open up the management agents. Okay, so this is a key step. If I come over into here and refresh, you can see we now have a couple of management agents. If I open up the Active Directory one, go to the connection screen, you can see there's no password here. So this is why we need to open it up. We need to plug that in. There is a fix for that on my blog. If you really don't want to enter the password, then you can use a version of the script that's up on my blog. But for the point of this demonstration, we also had some disabled accounts. So I want to go ahead and make sure that I'm not bringing in those disabled accounts. So what I need to do is go to the Select Attributes screen, find the attribute in Active Directory that's useful to us, which in this case is User Account Control. Once I select that, then the attribute is available to us within the next screen, which is called the Connection Filter. So I'm going to choose the object type User. I'm going to choose New. I'm going to scroll down here, User Account Control. It's bit on equals is the comparison operator, and I want a bit mask of 2. And then remember to click Add. I've done that hundreds of times, and just click OK, and it's very easy. Okay, so that's now a filter that's going to exclude disabled accounts from the metaverse. Okay, so I'm done with this one for this section. Now I also, because the SharePoint Management Agent makes use of a additional assembly, because of that, we must open this to refresh the schema. And that's not currently documented, but you must do it the first time you configure this. So we're basically going to click through the name screen. You can see here, there's all the details of my SharePoint farm. And when I click OK, we're going to get a little egg timer whilst it goes back, refreshes the schema for us. And then we can click OK out of this, and we are good to go. So now we've set that up, we want to perform a sync run. If we come back to our script, the PowerShell module also includes some commandlets that allow us to start or kick off a sync run. These have been created for us by the previous commandlet, so you can see them in here. So I'm doing like a full import, or the equivalent of a full import that we used to have in user profile sync. You see the initial one is doing a full import, so this is bringing information in from Active Directory to the Active Directory connector space in MIM. And you can see that there's 224 ads. And if we click the ad, we can see the information that's coming across. Then we do a full sync, which synchronizes the AD connector space with the metaverse. Okay, and you can see, so in this case, there's 211 projections. A projection means we're creating a new object in the metaverse. So the filtering has worked, and you can see the outbound sync at the bottom there tells us that it's going to push 210 objects back to SharePoint when we get to that stage of the operation. Then we do a full import from SharePoint. It's kind of pointless the first time, but this is still the model we have to make use of. There's obviously no objects. Then we synchronize those no objects with the metaverse. And then in the next stage, it's going to go ahead and hopefully do an export in a couple of seconds. Should kick in. Oh, no, I forgot. Over here, this guy is asking me to confirm my action. So once I click yes, it will go ahead and perform the appropriate runs. Here's our export. This is the slowest stage, naturally, because it's using a web service, first of all, and it's also pumping quite a lot of data across to SharePoint, including those images from Active Directory.
May I ask a question?
Sure, go ahead.
I have a problem with the profile pictures that you mentioned. Only half of the pictures are coming to SharePoint.
Mm-hmm. No. In order for that to work right now, you must use the farm account. That's your only option at present. And then once the export has succeeded, so you can see we had the 210 ads, and you also notice there's those updates. And if we click those updates, we actually see what the information is. It's all related to the manager field. You can see down the bottom here, because manager is reference data, it can't be done in the first run round because that object doesn't exist, right? So you can't reference null. So that's why reference data has to use this concept of confirming receipts. And then we'll do a delta import and a delta sync to make sure that everything's happy. And so now we have effectively the data in all three places as we wish. If we switch over to the SharePoint environment and refresh this screen, I'm hoping it's still, yeah, it's always a lag here. But we should see, obviously, the profile number increase. Yeah, we got 211 there. If we go in manage do a search here just to bring one up quickly. So here's Hazel that we saw earlier in the 2013 environment. To see all our data's in here, title, etc. At least the ones that we wanted, or the ones the toolkit configures for us. But there's no profile picture. Okay, so that's null at the moment. Because just like with user profile sync, once we have the image data in SharePoint, we need to update these thumbnails. Okay, so this should make sense in a little bit. This is the My Site host, and you can see the user photos folder there with 0 items. That was from before I ran the sync. If I refresh this, we should see 211 or something close to that. And if we look at these, they'll all be GUIDs, okay? So it's SharePoint, you know, we've got to use GUIDs if we can. But it makes sense in this scenario, right? Because we could have hundreds of thousands of these things. So these are the pictures, but they're not the thumbnails, right? This is the raw data from AD. We need to convert that into the thumbnail formats used by SharePoint, Outlook, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the same as before. We run a SharePoint commandlet to update the profile photo store. And the more tired you are, the more difficult it is to say that commandlet name. So we'll just run this, and this will take a wee while. And as it's running, basically, it's going to create 3 thumbnails for each of those images in that photos library that we saw. So we need to let this basically do its thing. It's not very exciting. But if we refresh this screen, eventually we'll see this number start to increment. Yep.
What would happen if we change the setting to external identity manager? It's still Active Directory import, right?
Yeah, so the question is what happens if we do press that switch to use Identity Manager? Well, it will work, and basically that switch disables, you know, allowing the creation of sync connections inside the UPA. But you will run into problems with importing reference data, a manager field.
Actually, you have to do it twice.
Yeah.
After that, the time job will be created and the reference will work. I tested it in my
Let's come back over here. You see now it's pretty much complete, right? I'm trying to do the math in my head. I'm not that good at that anymore. But that's all our photos. If we have a look in here, we should see they've now got the correct name, you know, the low-res thumbnail, the medium, and the standard for each user. Okay? And just very quickly, if we come back over here, refresh Hazel's profile page, we should see the image here as well. So there we go. Now, just to speed things up in terms of kind of the logistics of the demonstration, I'm going to go ahead and do what every SharePoint demonstrator really does not like doing on a stage and kick off a full crawl. But don't worry, we won't sit there waiting for it. We'll go ahead and do some other stuff whilst it's running, hopefully, in the background. Yep. Mm-hmm. It is not one that ships inside MIM, but there are 4 commercially available Salesforce management agents on the marketplace. Correct. There is no way within SharePoint 2016 to augment profile data with external line of business systems. That's what I'm going to show you next. So if you remember on the SharePoint 2013 machine, it's a great Planck question, that. Thank you very much. I'll give you some money later. We've got these BCS connections, right? So I want to achieve what those do using MIM. And it's actually better because you'll notice there's 2 of them here. I only actually need to do 1 core configuration to get this all working. So I'm going to go over to MIM. I'm going to go to the management agents area or tab, go ahead and create. But this time I'm going to pick SQL Server way down the bottom here. And I'm going to type, just give it a name, Fabricam HR. And I always recommend using a descriptive name like this. Try and avoid what the toolkit's done, where it's ADMA, SPMA, right? Because you might have more than one SharePoint farm, and there's lots of things to consider about the name. They're just defaults, of course. So this is where we enter in our connection information to the SQL Server database. And I'm trying to make sure that I remember these. So it's just things like the server name and those kind of things. The database is Fabricam HR. Now, the name of the table was employee data. And then I'm going to choose the the multi-value table. In this case, I'm going to put in the view of employee school. And then I've got some connection information. I'm going to use an account I know exists called the SQL MA. I'm not going to tell you what the password is, but you can probably guess. And our domain is Fabricam. And you can see it's connected to the database, and it's brought back a representation of the schema of the database in MIM terminology. So MIM is a strongly typed system. I know we've probably all seen many sessions in the last week on loosely typed systems, but for this stuff, typing is absolutely essential. So you can see, we have an ID there, which is a GUID. We've got the email address, et cetera, et cetera. And it's by default, it's picked that up. It said, oh, there's a GUID there. We're going to use that as what's called the anchor. Now, it doesn't have to be a GUID, but I strongly recommend you use one. And this is the only time you'll ever hear me say this. What a lot of customers have done is use email address as the anchor. That's a very bad idea. Okay? The anchor must never change. If it does change, the original object is going to be deleted and a new thing will be created. Okay? So stay away from things like email addresses, which naturally could change if somebody changes their last name, or indeed the company changes its name. Okay? So just make sure you use a unique identifier. Oh, I'm sorry, I also need to select what I'm going to do with that multi-value information. So I'm going to choose the attribute name. If you remember, that was the contrived column. We're going to see attribute name there, and then we're going to add in here the value of school. And that was a string. Oops. What have I done wrong here? School. Then we've got a filter. I don't need a filter at this stage, but we do need a join rule. So what we're doing here is we want to make sure that we match the information with what's already in the metaverse. And we're going to do that via the email address. So, we've already brought in 200 users. They've all got an email address. This is going to be how we join the data together. So we come in here. It's employee email. We want to match a metaverse property, and I just happen to know that that is male. Okay? So that's our condition. It warns us about that's not as performant as it could be. Perhaps use a GUID. This time an email is okay. Click next. And then we have everybody's favorite screen in MIM. This is the, sort of the way the data is flowing around between the different systems. And so we want to make sure that these things are all matched up. So you can see on the right-hand side here, we have the metaverse attributes, and these are the attributes from our database. So for example, I want the employee ID to come over to a property in the metaverse. And there is one called employee ID. If I just type E, it'll make it a bit easier. But remember I spoke about data typing and how important that is. Well, in the default MIM, the employee ID, I believe, is a string, and we don't have a string. We have an integer. So we couldn't use this one. But I'd also advise, generally speaking, stay away from the default attributes in the metaverse and instead create your own. So I'm going to go just basically next through this, and we'll come back to that. I'm going to then switch to the metaverse designer. These are all the objects in the metaverse. If I bring up the person object, double-click that, I get this screen. I'm going to create some new attributes for the information that I want in our environment. Okay, so the first one we'll do is SPS school. And then we have SPS employee ID. Oops. And I'm going to make sure to select that that's a number, which is a euphemism for an int in MIM language. Then we have SPS employee type. And that's a string as well, and employee status. It will be eventually, yeah. I'm just using that kind of naming convention so that it's easier to work the demo, really, because they're all in the same place. But you don't have to do that. But, the point of showing it like this is just to give you an indication of how much pecking and clicking you've got to be doing, right? And one little mistake can have disastrous consequences. So that's the whole planning stuff, but also the skill up required with MIM. So now we've got those, I can reopen that management agent, go back to our attribute flow, and hook these things up. Okay, so our employee ID was SPS employee ID. And we're going to import that. Okay, so just do new, and it comes up here. And we've got employee type, and school. That'll go over. That's our multi-value column, if you remember. That's our SPS school there. And our status was the employee status. So you can see, hopefully, already the importance of having a mapping spreadsheet that details all of this before you go ahead and try and configure it. Right? If you don't have it set in your mind what you're trying to achieve, and you've got that kind of input information to the task, it's a nightmare, and it can be very confusing. One tip I'll give you, though, is perhaps the most important MIM tip you'll ever hear, is you can make this screen bigger. You'll be amazed how many people don't know you can do that. Yes, you can. Everything I'm doing, you could script, yeah. For the school, I made a mistake. So I proved my own point. Thank you. So if we come back over here, where's it gone? Oh, what's going on? It's down here. Yeah, so yeah, I didn't do a multi-value for this guy, so I'm going to remove this attribute. I can't do that, so I have to go over here, fix that up. So I need, yeah. Yeah, and I've done this demo probably 30 times, and I still, make mistakes. Where's our person gone? It's back here. Oh, I need to delete it first. Employees, there we go, remove that guy. School, make sure it's multi-valued. Now we're good, now we can go back, re-add it in here. There. Okay, so that's the SQL Server side of things. Now we need to do the SharePoint side of things, right? So we need to configure where this information is going to go into SharePoint. So to do that, we're going to need to create some properties, of course. We don't have those properties yet, or not all of them at any rate. So if we come back over here, Manage User Properties, we'll go ahead and create some eventually. So I need one called Employee ID. Of course, I can't use the SPS naming here because that's reserved for SharePoint properties. That will be an integer. And I've also, these are important. I need to make sure that my privacy setting is correct and where it's going to show up in, the social aspects of SharePoint. So again, something else that needs to go into that planning worksheet so that you can script the creation of these things as well, or make it less error prone. And we'll have employee type. Now in this case, I'm going to configure that to go into a term set which I've already created ahead of the demo. So this information is going to end up in the Manage Metadata service application as a term set. Same thing for the privacy and its display characteristics. And we're also going to do one more called employee status. And I'll do a term set for this as well. You can see it there, employee status. Same thing with the privacy. And those options. Okay, so I've created the new properties in SharePoint. I don't need to do one for school because that's a property already configured by default in SharePoint and mapped to the keywords in the term store. So now I need to go ahead and do the MIM configuration for that. The first thing I need to do, because I've changed the schema of the user profile store, I need to refresh the schema in the management agent in order to be able to select those new attributes. Okay, so I select the SharePoint MA, do actions, refresh schema. It's going to ask me for the password here. And it's going to do its thing, and it's going to go back, speak to SharePoint, find out what all those new properties are, and add that information into our environment so we can go ahead and use it. You can see it says that the schema has been validated and then it's been committed. So now if I open up here and go to the attribute flow, this is where I'm exporting from Active Directory at the moment. We'll just concentrate on users. So you can see, the picture, the last name, etc. As you would expect, These are the mappings that the toolkit provides for us. You can see how department goes to two different ones, so just bear that in mind. One is the SharePoint property, the other one is a term set for department. And we're going to leverage that in a second. In fact, I did make a mistake, another mistake. So I go back to my SQL Server and add that department to this flow because I want the department to come from the database, not from Active Directory. Oops. So it's here, but I do want it to end up in the term set, so I'm going to select the standard mapping in here, and select the right one, click OK. So now we'll do the SharePoint side of things. Go to the Select Attributes option, and we'll see our new properties will show up in here. Some of the ones that are already done by default, and then, the ones that we've added, all hopefully with employee, start with employee. There we go. So just select those new attributes, basically. We also need to select school because that one isn't configured by the toolkit at present. And there we go. Now we can go to our attribute flow. And we can go through and select the employee ID, take it from our SPS employee ID. This time, though, it's an export, so make sure to check that, add that. We do the same thing for employee status, employee type. There's that, hiding. And you'll note the department mapping I showed you earlier, we don't need to do that, so we had that before. The last one is schools. There we go. So now we've got these 5 or so additional export properties that will go over into SharePoint. The last thing I need to do is create sync runs for the SQL Server MA. It's very straightforward, but in this scenario, we're only ever going to do an import. We're replicating that BDC approach. So we go ahead and create one that does a full import, a full sync, and then one for a full import. And these are good because these are very few options when it comes to sync runs for SQL Server. It's a bit more complicated for things like Active Directory. But we do need to think about, well, how many in a go, what sort of batch limit do we want to put in place here? If we're dealing with hundreds of thousands of objects, it's not sensible to try and do that in one chunk. So we have those options there. But we just accept the defaults. So now I'm going to run those sync runs to get the information, hopefully, from SQL Server into the connector space for SQL Server. You can see we have 140 adds, so that's progress. You see how much quicker it is than the other management agents. Very simple SQL Server work going on behind the scenes. So here's our 217 adds. Now I'll go ahead and do a full sync, which syncs the connector space with the metaverse. We may even be able to get this demo to finish on time. So now I've done that. I know in this particular case, nothing's changed in Active Directory, so I don't have to do any sync runs for that. But once we've got this all set up and configured and we're running this on a sort of scheduled basis, maybe once a week or something like that, we'd need to add those sync runs into that script that we use to schedule the task. Right? Now I'm going to go ahead and do a full import with the SharePoint, because remember, we've changed the schema, that every time we change a schema, we need to do a full import. And you can see that it's already telling us that there's 150 updates. This is the metaverse representation of an object. If we double click one, and we're lucky, you can see there's the department, what the old value was. It was empty, now it's going to be legal. Same thing for employee ID. It's got the status and the type. And we also have our school's multi-value data. Okay? So it's all working so far. Now I'm going to do a full, hang on, what have I done wrong? Yep, I'll do a full sync to synchronize the metaverse. And you can see that we actually don't have any projections or joins or anything, but we have at that outbound synchronization. In other words, just like when we did the original export to SharePoint, this is doing that outbound synchronization for those additional attributes. And so this is the moment of truth, basically, and if it doesn't work, I just go home and cry. We weren't an export, and this is actually, you know, hopefully going to go ahead and push all of that stuff into the SharePoint profile store. So basically what I've configured replicates exactly what we had in the SharePoint 2013 environment using 2 BCS sync connections. This time we've done it, though, with a single management agent. Or, you know, there would be 2 in the 2013 version of this if we could have done this then. And it's actually pretty straightforward stuff. It's really just the pointy clickiness of it. It's a lot of pecking around. You've got to make sure you do things in the right order. Then if you don't, you know, you see what happens, right? You have to go back and clean things up first and so on. Was there a question, sir? No, I mean, basically to automate this, sorry, the question was, is the only way to automate this a scheduled task? So we can, everything you've seen me do in this UI, I could do in PowerShell. The problem is I've got to figure out how. Yeah. But once we've done this type of configuration, we then can basically have a PowerShell script, which is what actually performs the sync runs. And so you could schedule that however you like. It doesn't need to be a Windows scheduled task. You could do that in any other way of your choosing, because it's the PowerShell that you're actually executing effectively.
Can we export the BCA connection from 2013 and import it in the identity manager?
Yeah, so the question is, can we sort of migrate or move across a BCS connection to what I've just shown you? No, is the answer to that. Sorry. No, theoretically, what you could do, if you really wanted to, is basically, you know, write script that would interrogate the 2013 configuration and then replicate it using the new approach. But you'd be better off to just, because use this as an opportunity to perhaps improve, tweak, clean up the BCS connections. Okay, so you see there's 210 updates. You know, it's our department, employee ID, etc. So it's all worked, at least as far as MIM is concerned. And this is a very important point that I'm desperately trying to get to. If we come back over here to our user profile store, I have no information on that question, I'm afraid. And the more tired you are, obviously, the more annoying it becomes, especially when you just have a thing here. Anyway, so if we go into the user profiles, do the same search, we find, let's bring up somebody else. But you can see now the department is correctly configured. And here's an example of data quality being important, right? You know, if you're in sales, why are you a fire prevention specialist? But you never know, it might be cool. You know, the job title has come over there via one of the default mappings that we didn't alter. And then down here's our schools, okay, that this person went to. Very strange mix of education there, but never mind. Picture timestamp is an internal field that really shouldn't show up on that screen. But then down the bottom, we have 2 of our 3 values. So you can see the employee type has worked, and that's a term set value, right? So we can actually go and, whoa, everybody's favorite message. We'll see this in here eventually. I don't think we'll see it in 20 seconds according to this thing, but if we come into here, you can see that it's populated the type correctly. Those are the values from the database, but the employee status doesn't have any values. It's not been populated. And the reason for that is down here when I created it, and I did this deliberately for the purposes of the talk, you can see it's a closed term set. So the sync run hasn't got the permissions to add items into this term set, okay? Now, so it hasn't worked, okay, because we did something wrong. But the SharePoint management agent does not participate in confirming receipts. As far as MIM is concerned, that value was correctly exported to SharePoint. It doesn't know there was an error. It can't report there was an error. As far as MIM's concerned, it's worked. So what would I need to do to fix this up? I have to delete the connector space for SharePoint, delete the connector space for SQL Server, rerun the whole thing after I fix this. Okay. Again, the importance of planning is absolutely paramount. There's lots of little bits and pieces in this whole area where one little setting like that can, leave you scratching your head for 3 weeks, wondering why it's not working in production or similar. Because as far as the metaverse is concerned and the SharePoint connector space is concerned, that value is there and exists. If we look at, if we look at the, we can search the connector space here. Well, yeah, if we're working with AD or something, another system, it's the management agent that's the thing that doesn't participate in receipts. And indeed, SharePoint can't provide it because all the management agent really does is call profile import export web service on SharePoint. So that would be what would need to be changed. But you can see in here, as far as the metaverse is concerned, that value is present and correct. Yep, question. Yeah, so the short version of that question is are there any improvements in terms of the claim provider support in Profile Sync? And the answer is no. It's identical to SharePoint 2013. Okay, so need to wrap up before we get kicked off the stage. Hopefully the demonstration has been useful, but shown you how to achieve the same end results using Microsoft Identity Manager and the SharePoint connector. But remember, if you don't have the requirements that I showed you, and you can get away with using Active Directory import, please use it, okay? It's perfectly adequate for, that common base scenario. The Identity Manager is an incredibly powerful capability. It's the most capable meta-directory in the marketplace. And I don't work for the company that makes it and sells it, right? But you've got to skill up. What we've also seen today is classic provisioning. In the MIM world, there's a concept of codeless provisioning where you've got a portal, funnily enough, built on SharePoint Server, and you can use that to configure workflows and provisioning, group management, et cetera, et cetera. That very well could be a better option for your enterprise identity management needs, but that's an additional cost part of the product. If you just want key, core synchronization, as we saw in the demonstration, there's no cost there, and it's extremely powerful, but you must skill up in MIM. You've got to plan this out. Because once you're down the road of this, once things get out of hand, especially when you're dealing with hundreds of thousands of users, it can be very painful to deal with just what we've seen today as a minor issue. Identity itself is the primary key, no pun intended, to a successful SharePoint deployment. Remember how many features effectively light up or work better because of the profile availability. Underlines again the importance of planning this stuff. I'll be in the expo hall after this session. I know we've gone over slightly. You can, welcome to come up for questions whilst I'm packing up and stuff. Otherwise, thanks very much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the show.